Thank you, Edgar. And first of all, I would like to thank Renaissance and IDRC for giving me this opportunity to be here today. I would like to thank So Win, Edgar, and Kimo personally for your hospitality, and thank you all for being here today. The idea of having this presentation is to, first of all, present an overview of Vietnam's public policy and public finance, and at the same time trying to be more relevant to the training programs that the Renaissance and the Fulbright School will implement later, hopefully with the funding from IDRC. So I'm going to talk about 5 things today. First of all, I would like to give an overview of Vietnam's economy because I would like to put the public finance in context. Without a bigger macroeconomy context, I don't think we can understand public finance properly. And then I'm going to go through 4 major topics in public finance: fiscal revenue, fiscal expenditure, fiscal decentralization, and then under the request of Kimo, I'm going to talk about public finance, financial management as well. And this is a brief history of Vietnam economy since we started reform in 1986. We call it đổi mới or economic innovation. All right. We started in 1986 at a pretty low level of economic performance. All right. And then if you look at this, the economy grew pretty fast in the 90s, but then we got hit by the Asian financial crisis in 97, 98, right? And the economy went down to the bottom of 4.8% in GDP growth in 99. And at that time, we implement a kind of comprehensive economic reform. I'm going to go back to the public finance reform later on. But at this point, there are 2 major reforms, one domestic, another international. The most important domestic reform in Vietnam, actually today, until today, is enterprise law in 1999. Basically, the law is quite simple, nothing sophisticated. The most important thing it does was to acknowledge the right of doing business of private people. All right, and then it opened up opportunities for everyone who wants to do business, who want to get rich, and who want to take advantage of their human capital. All right, and then another very important reform is associated with the BTA, US-Vietnam bilateral trade agreements that we signed in 2001. So together, these 2 reforms provide a new impetus for the economy that grew up pretty quickly until we was hit by another crisis, the recent global financial crisis, and then the economy went down. The point I would like to make here is, if you look at Vietnam public finance reform, you will see that reform go along with the economic reform more generally. That's the first point. The second point is, when we do reform, domestic reform, and we open up our trade, then we produce the best results for the economy. All right. So if you look at this, for example, here we have mini bank reform, we have FDI law. So domestic reform is combined with the first FDI law ever in Vietnam. And here you have enterprise law and the BTA goes together. All right. So this is a very brief introduction to Vietnam's economic reform in the last 2 decades. And now, if you look at this, you can see that now FDIs play a huge role in Vietnam. And if compare Vietnam's experience to other East Asian economies like South Korea, like Japan, like Taiwan, and like Hong Kong and Singapore, you don't see the big role of FDI as much. For example, in the 60s or 70s in South Korea or Taiwan, FDIs account for about 2%, 3% of the total investment. In Vietnam, at some point, FDIs accounts for 20 to 30% of total investment in the country. So FDI plays a very big role. And if you look at this, right now FDI plays the biggest role in terms of producing industrial output. All right, so FDIs account for about 45% of the total Vietnam's industrial output at the time being, which is the biggest sector in the economy. And another thing which is quite interesting is the state sector. Started as the biggest, the dominant force in the economy, now accounts for about less than a quarter, actually about 20-25% of total industrial production in the economies. So the private sectors now is actually the most important sectors driving the economy going forward. But at the same time, because of political reason, Vietnam is a single party system. So the Communist Party still want to maintain a big state sector, and that is why we don't fully realize our potential. And if you, going back to the point I mentioned earlier, if you look at this picture, Vietnam, right here. So in terms of the net FDI flows, Vietnam is doing very well. So if you take the absolute figures, absolute amounts of FDI, Vietnam is far behind China. But you take FDI as the percentage of GDP relatively to the economic size of the country, then Vietnam is performing even beyond China in terms of attracting FDI. And I think that attracting FDI is one key to success. It's not everything, but it's one important factor in giving us capital, expertise, and spillover effects to the whole economy. And another fact which is so important in Vietnam, as I mentioned earlier, is we are in the process of integrating deeper and deeper in the regional and global economy. If you look at this chart, Brunei, Singapore, Vietnam, and Malaysia participate in almost every regional trade agreements. All right, and right now, if you ask me what is the next big trade agreement between Vietnam and other partners, it's really hard to think about one, because we already signed the most important trade agreements, all right, with the ASEAN, ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus 6, or ASEP, TPP, EV, Vietnam, FTA, South Korea, Japan, bilateral FTA. So basically we signed them all. So it's really hard to think about the next step in terms of integration process. But from the public finance perspective, it's important because free trade agreements bring down tariffs for revenue. I'm going to go back to that. So this is, I present this not only because it's important for the economy wide, but it's crucial, it's critical for budget finance as well. And as I said, Vietnam is increasingly open. And if you take the total import and export as the percentage of GDP, Vietnam is now one of the most open economy in the world. All right, compared with the ASEAN, with China, we are above the average. And at the same time, Vietnam has been quite successful in diversifying the export markets. Now we are trading with the US. About 22% of our export and import come from the US, and EU, ASEAN, China.